the crowd fell silent. Not the familiar hush that settled before the blade dropped, but a weightier stillness, the kind that tightened throats and made even seasoned spectators of the guillotine shift uneasily in their places. On July 17, 1794, at the height of the Reign of Terror's most merciless stretch, something occurred in Paris that no one had seen before. 16 women ascended the scaffold that afternoon, and as each stood before death, they sang. It was not meant to unfold this way. By the summer of 1794, executions had become public ritual. Parisians gathered daily as carts creaked through the streets, carrying the condemned toward the square. Some prisoners begged, some shouted defiance, others wept. The Revolutionary Tribunal had refined death into a system, swift judgments, relentless sentences, a blade that rarely rested. But these 16 women, Carmelite nuns from Compiègne, turned their final moments into something the revolution could not command. One by one, they climbed the steps. One by one, their voices rose above the murmuring crowd. No screams, no frantic resistance, only hymns. The state had dissolved their convent, outlawed their vows, demanded their submission. It had tried to silence their faith. Instead, their faith echoed across the square. Witnesses spoke of an uneasy calm that settled over the onlookers. The usual jeers faded. Even the rhythm of the drums seemed uncertain. After each voice was cut short by the falling blade, the hymn continued, softer, thinner, but unbroken, until only a single voice remained. And then silence. 10 days later, the machinery of terror devoured its own architects. The men who had orchestrated the bloodshed fell beneath the same steel. Across France, whispers spread that the nuns' final song had marked a turning point, that their deaths had hastened the end of the killing. Divine intervention or coincidence, history leaves unanswered. But that summer afternoon endures as one of the Revolution's most haunting moments, when 16 women faced the guillotine not with cries of despair, but with song. The Revolutionary Tribunal's verdict: 16 nuns sent to the guillotine. The Carmelite community of Compiègne had managed nearly a year in hiding before the state caught up with them. When the Revolution abolished religious orders in 1790 and declared all monastic vows void, most communities dissolved. These 20 sisters did not. Instead, they divided into 4 small groups and rented modest rooms across the town of Compiègne. Outwardly, they dressed as civilians. Inwardly, they remained what they had always been. Each morning they slipped quietly to a nearby church. There a priest, himself in disguise, celebrated Mass for them. They owned only a single set of civilian clothing apiece, not as an act of humility, but because poverty allowed nothing more. Their life was reduced to the barest essentials: prayer, silence, waiting. At their head stood Mother Teresa of St. Augustine. Among the sisters was Mother Henriette of Jesus, a relative of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, minister to Louis XIV. The youngest, Sister Constance, was 29. The eldest, Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified, had lived 78 years. They came from different families, different stations in society. What united them was a conviction the revolution now called criminal, that some loyalties outranked the state. On June 21, 1794, agents of the Committee of Surveillance struck all 4 apartments at once. Drawers were overturned, mattresses slashed, papers seized. Among their few possessions, officials found what they considered proof: a portrait of Louis XVI and a prayer invoking protection for the king. Evidence, they said, of royalist sympathy and unlawful religious assembly. The next day, soldiers returned with warrants. 16 sisters were arrested. 3 happened to be away visiting family and escaped detention. The prisoners were confined in a former visitation convent, now a makeshift jail, alongside English Benedictine nuns already under guard. 20 days later, on July 12th, the mayor of Compiègne arrived with soldiers and an order: transfer to Paris for trial. There was an unexpected complication. The sisters' only civilian garments were soaking in wash water. The mayor, pressed for time, made a fateful decision. They would travel in their prohibited religious habits. So they entered Paris unmistakably as Carmelites: brown wool robes, white veils, visible signs of consecration. They were delivered to the conciergerie, the antechamber of death during the Terror. Most prisoners remained there a night or two before appearing before the tribunal. The nuns stayed 5. During those days they formally withdrew the civic oath they had once been compelled to swear. They understood what awaited them. Mother Teresa, aware of the executioner's grim efficiency, hands that cut hair from the nape of the neck before the blade fell, spent hours sewing. From scraps of cloth she fashioned 16 white caps. Simple coverings meant to spare her spiritual daughters at least one final indignity. On July 17th, they were led before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The law of 22 Prairial had stripped trials of defense counsel, witnesses, even meaningful deliberation. Only 2 verdicts remained possible: acquittal or death. Conviction required merely moral certainty, a phrase elastic enough to mean political necessity. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had already sent thousands to the guillotine. Cases moved swiftly, sometimes dozens in a single day. The 16 stood weak from confinement but upright, wearing their habits, their cropped hair hidden beneath Mother Teresa's caps. The accusations were sweeping: fanaticism, illegal religious gatherings, refusal to embrace republican virtue, sympathy for the monarchy. One of the older sisters asked the prosecutor to define fanaticism. Pressed to clarify, he answered plainly their religious belief itself constituted the crime. In his words, it made them enemies of public freedom. Mother Teresa claimed responsibility. She defended her sisters and attempted to bear the charges alone. It changed nothing. The outcome had been decided long before they entered the courtroom. All 16 were condemned to death by guillotine. The sentence would be executed that very afternoon. Between judgment and execution, they were granted a single request. They asked for a pail of hot water. They washed their soiled civilian garments, then deliberately returned to their religious habits, choosing to die as they had lived. Cart to the scaffold. The process of public guillotine executions in Paris. The tumbrils waited in the courtyard of the conciergerie. 2-wheeled wooden carts, built for hauling refuse and manure, they had become the Revolution's chosen carriage of death. Each could carry a dozen prisoners. For the 16 Carmelites, 2 were required. The executioner kept 8 to 10 such carts in rotation, ready for days when the tribunal's verdicts came in clusters. Most were left bare wood. A few, reserved for certain political offenders, were painted red, as though their fate needed to be announced before it arrived. The prison bell rang. In the courtyard, known grimly as the Corner of the 12, the condemned assembled. Guards bound the sisters' hands behind their backs. One by one they climbed into the carts without assistance. No resistance. No tears. They settled onto the hard benches, brown habits folding neatly around them. The gates opened. The wheels rolled. The route from the conciergerie to the Place du Trône Renversé stretched roughly 3 miles through the heart of Paris. The journey lasted 2 to 3 hours, not because of distance but design. Executions were meant to be seen. The carts moved deliberately through crowded streets so citizens could gather, jeer, spit, or hurl scraps at those branded enemies of the Republic. Usually, the mob obliged with noise and fury. But this procession did not follow the script. As the tumbrils creaked over cobblestones, the nuns began to sing. First the Miserere, the great psalm of repentance. Then the office of readings, prayers once whispered within cloister walls. The Salve Regina followed, an ancient hymn to the Virgin that Carmelites had carried on their lips for centuries. Their voices rose above the rumble of wheels, above the restless hum of Paris. Gradually, the usual shouting diminished. Witnesses later described an unfamiliar stillness falling across the streets. Some said the crowd seemed unsettled. Others believed they glimpsed for a fleeting moment a memory of the France that had existed before suspicion and denunciation became civic virtues. The sisters sang the office of the dead, for those who had already passed beneath the blade. They sang for their country, and Paris for once listened. The guillotine had been relocated to the Place du Trône Renversé only weeks earlier. Maximilien Robespierre had ordered it moved from the city center. He was preparing a grand civic festival for his cult of the Supreme Being and did not want the daily spectacle of blood to disturb the solemnity of his vision. so the machine was dismantled and rebuilt on the eastern edge of the capital. Between mid-June and late July 1794, more than 1,000 people were executed there. Their bodies were interred in nearby mass graves, layered into the earth with mechanical regularity. The scaffold itself rose roughly 15 feet high, constructed from heavy timber. Stairs climbed the rear. A platform, open to the sky, stood enclosed by railings on 3 sides. At its center towered the guillotine, 2 upright posts grooved with metal tracks guiding the weighted blade in its fall. The triangular blade was fixed to a heavy block, adding force to ensure a decisive stroke. At the front lay the bascule, a hinged plank that tipped the body forward, and the lunette, a wooden collar that closed around the neck. Red-painted baskets waited beside the frame. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, worked with 5 to 8 assistants. They led each prisoner up the stairs, secured them to the bascule, fastened the lunette, and released the mechanism. When practiced hands moved efficiently, the time from mounting the scaffold to death measured less than a minute. On busy days, dozens were processed within hours. And now, as the singing procession approached, the machinery stood ready once more. Final prayers at the place of execution. How the guillotine was carried out. The carts reached the Place du Trône Renversé in the late afternoon light. The sisters were still singing as they stepped down from the tumbrils. The hymn had shifted now to Veni Creator Spiritus, a plea for the descent of the Holy Spirit. Around them stood 24 other condemned prisoners scheduled for death that day. History would remember only the 16 whose voices did not break. They formed a line before Mother Teresa of St. Augustine. One by one, each sister knelt and asked the question spoken at every great threshold of their religious lives. Permission to die, Mother? In her hands, the prioress held a small statue of the Virgin Mary, scarcely larger than her palm. Each sister kissed it. Each received a final blessing. Even the executioner's assistants paused long enough to allow the last prayers to be completed. Whether it was professional patience or something deeper, an awareness that this was no ordinary execution, no one can say. Sister Constance, the youngest, went first. Witnesses recorded that she climbed the scaffold steps without assistance. At the top, she renewed her vows aloud, her voice steady enough for the sisters below to hear. Then she placed herself upon the bascule. The assistant secured her gently, closed the lunette around her neck. The blade fell. It was over in an instant. The executions proceeded in order of profession, youngest to oldest. Each sister ascended the stairs. Each renewed her vows. Each surrendered without resistance. The crowd did not roar. On most days, spectators shouted approval, mocked the condemned, applauded the falling blade. That afternoon, silence spread across the square. With every execution, the hymn thinned. 16 voices became 15. 15 became 14. Each descent of the blade erased another note from the air. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified, 78 years old, is said to have spoken to the executioners before mounting the steps. I forgive you, my friends. I forgive you with all the longing of my heart that God may forgive me. Her words carried over the hushed crowd. Then she too disappeared beneath the steel. At last, only Mother Teresa remained. She had watched 15 of her daughters die. 15 times she had whispered, "Go, my daughter." Now she stood alone before the scaffold. Accounts describe her ascent as calm, almost luminous in composure. She renewed her vows in a clear voice, placed herself upon the bascule, and waited. The blade fell for the 16th and final time. Their bodies were buried in a common grave alongside the others executed that day. 10 days later, on July 27, 1794, the National Convention ordered the arrest of Maximilien Robespierre. The following day, he and 21 allies were guillotined. The Reign of Terror collapsed soon after. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dismantled. The fever of mass executions began to subside. Many French Catholics believed the sacrifice of the Carmelites marked a turning point, that their deaths somehow broke the momentum of violence consuming France. The 3 sisters who had escaped arrest survived the revolution. One later published a detailed account, ensuring the memory endured. In 1906, Pope Pius X beatified the 16 martyrs, formally recognizing them as victims of the Revolution. Their feast day was set on July 17th. More than 2 centuries later, on December 18, 2024, Pope Francis declared them saints through equipollent canonization, affirming what generations had already believed. Today, the Place du Trône Renversé bears a different name. Parisians cross it daily on their way to work, to cafes, to ordinary life. Beneath nearby ground lie the remains of those executed during the Great Terror, their names carved into stone. Among them are the 16 Carmelites who sang as they died. If you had stood in that crowd on July 17, 1794, watching one woman after another climb the scaffold, hearing their hymn grow fainter with every fall of the blade, what would you have done? Would you have joined the cheers? Or would you have stood silent, confronted by a conviction the Revolution itself could not silence? The Revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity. On its most terrible afternoon, 16 cloistered nuns embodied those words in a way no tribunal could legislate and no blade could erase.